All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to my channel, Maths Made Easy with Terry in 10 minutes. Okay. So today we're talking about absolute value of modulus. Okay. And I'm going to just try to make the basics, lay the background for it, talk about the 10 absolute value properties today, things to note of in this video, and we just talk about it. And I'm going to talk about the three things or three methods of solving absolute values, or the three types of absolute values that we're going to be looking at as well. But before I jump into all of that, okay, I want to first tell you what's an absolute value. So an absolute value of modulus of a number or integer is the actual distance of the integer from 0 in a number line. So what am I saying is that if this is a number line, so this is 1, this is 2, this is 3, and let's say this is -1, -2, -3. So the absolute value of modulus of that number is the actual distance of the integer from 0. So if this is 0, okay, all the way to this, to 2 here, the absolute value of the distance is 2. From 0 as well to this, it's also 2. Is that making sense? So you can see that irrespective of the direction you go, it's always going to be positive. So usually the absolute value of a number is denoted by placing the number between two vertical lines. So for example, if I have something like I have 8, okay? So I can write this like this. So this is the absolute value or absolute value of 8, okay? So therefore, I can now say if y is equal to an absolute value, so you read it like y is the modulus of x, okay? Or y is equal to the absolute value of x. So basically, this is how you say it. So that means that with that now, the absolute value of x is equal to x if x is greater or equal to 0. Or you can also say the absolute values of x is equal to minus x if x is less than 0. Okay, so when we're talking about absolute values, we are referring to the values if it's greater or equal to 0 or less than 0. So also, you also notice as well that we can apply this to any kind of number. So for instance, if I say the absolute values of 6 is equal to 6, because 6 is greater than what? 0. Remember, this is the first rule. If I say the absolute value of -4 will be equal to minus of -4, because it should be equal to 4, because -4 is going to be less than what? 0. Okay, so when it's absolute value, if it's less than 0, you put a minus sign there just to turn it to positive. And if it's a positive sign, it's just going to be the same thing. So you need to keep this in mind, okay? This is the first thing to keep in mind. So you can find several expressions like this, similar expressions like this. So if, for instance, I say, let's find the absolute value of x plus 5, okay? So that means, remember I told you, if it's less than 0, you put a minus. If it's greater than 0, it will just be that value, okay? So that means there are two possible things for this expression. So that means if it's greater than 0, so that means it will be x plus 5. That means if x plus 5 is greater or equal to 0. That makes sense? But if it's less than 0, that means x plus 5 will be equal to minus x plus 5. That means if x plus 5 is less than 0. Now, from the first one, we can further solve it or break it down. Okay? So that means if x plus 5 is greater than 0, you take 5 to the other side. So that means x must be greater or equal to minus what? 5. Okay? It's greater or equal to minus 5. The same thing, if you take 5 to the other side, okay? So it will be 5 to the other side, and that will give you minus 5. So that means it will be now x is less than what? Minus 5. All right. I know this looking with there's a lot of things going on now. Like there's a lot of things. Okay. I'm going to break it down now, okay? I'm going to talk about it, about bringing out some things that you need to note, okay? So first thing, there are about 3 things or 2 things to note first. Then I'm going to talk about that. Then I'll talk about the 10 properties of it. than what we're going to talk about in this series. Okay, so I'm just trying to lay the background before we start solving. All right, so there are two things to note. All right, I'm going to try to write it down so that you can also take note of it in your book as well. So two things to note. The first thing is that there is no absolute value for 0, definitely, because we're starting from 0. Because remember, we told you absolute values changes the sign of the number into positive and 0. So, and 0 has no sign. So that means the first thing is that the absolute value of 0 will still be 0. Okay, so that's the first thing to note, that 0 has no absolute value. So, number one, there is no absolute value for 0 because, let me clean this. So because the absolute value changes the sign of the number into positive. And as you know, and 0 has no sign. So the reason I'm writing it down, so that in case you're taking notes, you know what to write, okay? So that means, first thing, there is no absolute value for 0 because 0 has no sign, all right? The second thing I want you to note is that if the number is positive, then it will result in a positive number only, okay? Can you see? That is the reason why I gave you in this first page where I said, if it's positive, it's going to result in a positive number only, okay? And if it's negative, it will also change to positive. So like in this case, it was negative, but the final answer you get is positive. So that means in order to solving absolute value, it means that you have to remove any negative sign in front of the number and to think of all numbers as positive. So you can see from the number line I was talking about, although we're going to the positive side of the number line, it was still 2. We're going to the negative side of the number line, it was still 2. So always think about all the numbers as positive. Is that okay? So with that, now we can now talk about the second thing to note, that if the number is positive, then it will result in a positive number only. Okay? And also, if the number is negative, then the modulus of this number will also be a positive number. So therefore, we can now, so basically you are now removing the sign of all negative and think about all the numbers positive, okay? So it means to remove, get this out of the way. So to remove any negative sign in front of the number, and to think of all numbers as positive or 0. Okay, so that's what I'm trying to say. Okay, so the two things to keep in mind: there's no absolute values for 0. And if a number is positive, the answer you get should be positive. And if the number is negative, the answer will also be what? Positive. All right. That is two things to note. Then now I'm going to just quickly talk about the 10 properties of absolute values. Okay. I'm not going to go deep into each of them. Okay. I'll just state them. I'm going to just come back to them time to time. So because of time, I won't go over everything, but you can feel free to research them and talk about them. So the 10 absolute value properties. So the first one is definitely non-negativity. So that means it can't be negative, okay? So you can't solve an absolute value and you come up with negative. So it's non-negativity. So that means the absolute value of a particular variable must always be greater or equal to 0. Okay. Now the next one is what we call positive definitiveness. So positive definiteness. So definiteness. Okay. So here we have x must always be equal to what? 0. So therefore, we can now say a is equal to 0. Okay. So it's positive definiteness. So that means you must always, absolute value of a number must always be equal to 0. The other one has a multiplicative property. Okay. So here is going to be x multiplied by y. So if you multiply two variables, it's the same thing as x, modulus of x multiplied by the absolute value of what? Y. Now we also have what we call subadditivity. Okay. So what it means, similar to the multiplicative property, it means that when you sum two absolute values like this, it's always less than or equal to the value of x plus the absolute value of y. Okay. And also you also have some symmetry as well. So that's the fifth property, symmetry. It means that you have the absolute value of the negative value is the same thing as the absolute value of the positive value. Now, the other 4 or 5 types you should take note of, but I will just state them as well. So the first one is identity of indiscernible. So it's what we call, it's an equivalent of positive definiteness, but it's similar, so it's derived from it, but we're not talking about each of them. So it's so we have this. So what we are just saying here is that when you have x minus y, the absolute values in some cases for an identity value should be equal to 0. Then we also have what we call triangle inequality. Okay, we have triangle inequality. So for triangle inequality, the same thing. It's the same thing as we expect when we say if you subtract two absolute value of each side is equal to the absolute value of the first minus the third side plus the absolute value of the third side minus the first side. So something like this as well. We also have preservation of division as well. And it's the 7th one. Sorry, the 8th one, I beg your pardon. So we also have preservation of division. So from the word preservation of division. So that will give you, for instance, you're dividing two values that are absolute is equal to when the first value divided by the absolute value of the second. And 9th one, I think let's just leave it as the 9 properties, okay? The 10th one is really, really tricky. It's a derivative from the other one. So I will just say, let's leave it at 9 absolute value properties, okay? It's what we call, it's called, the 9th one is called the equivalent of subadditivity. Yeah, so equivalent of subadditivity, okay? Here is the same thing as x minus y will be greater or equal to the absolute value of x minus the absolute value of y all together. So these are the 9 absolute value properties. Okay, so I've talked about the absolute value properties. I've talked about the 2 things to note. Now, the reason why I'm just trying to do this introduction like this is that so that it will just lay the background before we start solving. And quickly, what we're going to be talking about in this series, okay, from Modulus, I'm going to be talking about several things. So I'm going to talk about the first thing, how to graph it, how to draw the graph. So graphing, how to graph Modulus graph. Then also I'm going to talk about inequalities. So modulus that have inequalities, all right? So I'm going to show you how to solve questions that have inequalities. So we'll talk about those that have less than. I'll talk about those that have greater than, okay? So we'll start with those with less than, or maybe we'll start with greater than, depending. We can start with greater than questions, okay? And after that, I will talk about some less than questions that have less than. And what we mean less than is like this, greater than like that. I also talk about questions that are a little bit complex. So that means it has a combination of 1 or 2 things in a question. Then also I'll talk about equal to questions. So when I mean equal to questions that have equal to sign, okay, or equalities. Sometimes we will call it equalities. I'll talk about the simple one, all right? I'll talk about some simple equalities question, and I'll talk about some complex ones, some that have maybe on both sides, having the modulus on both sides and stuff like that. So that is it. So that is it for absolute values of modulus. So feel free, have a look at it, go over the video. You can pause it at any time, record this, take note of it, pause it, record. Sorry, not record, I meant pause it, then take note, then play it again, all right? So have a look at it. But from next video now, we'll start solving questions, all right? I'm going to show you how to graph it. I'm going to show you how to find greater than and less than question, how you solve it. And I'll show you how to do with equalities also. All right. I'll see you in the next video. If you have any question, feel free, put it in the chat box, or you can send me an email directly and I'll get back to you. All right. Thank you very much.